Sometimes you find just the mask you need using the mask section and you're ready to skip right down to the output section. There's also times when you find a mask that's close to what you need, but you want to make some changes to it before you use it. The Modify section provides a variety of ways to customize your masks, many of which are new in TK7. The ability to modify masks like this is something I could only dream about back when I first started using luminosity masks. The first button in the section, the A button, executes an auto levels adjustment on the mask, making the brightest pixels pure white and the darkest pixels black. This is an easy way to introduce more white and black values into your mask, so that the revealed areas will be even more revealed and the concealed areas will be even more concealed. It's especially useful on masks that have low contrast to begin with, like some of the zone masks or perhaps a mid-tone mask. The most obvious change in the Modify section is the three-handled slider. This allows you to make levels modifications to your mask directly from the module without opening a levels adjustment window. If you prefer to open a levels adjustment window, you still can just by holding down Control or Command on your keyboard and then clicking on the slider instead of moving any of the handles. The slider handles are the same as in the levels adjustment. The one on the left darkens the shadows, the one on the right lightens the highlights, and the one in the middle adjusts midtones. There's quite a few situations where this type of modification is useful, but here are a few examples. Sometimes a Lights 1 mask selects too much of the image, but a Lights 2 mask selects too little. In this case, you could modify the Lights 1 using the midtone slider and moving it to the right. This allows you to make a mask that's in between a Lights 1 and a Lights 2. And in this way, you could make a mask that's in between any two of the standard masks. To reset the sliders and the mask, you can just click the counterclockwise button here on the right. Another way to use this is to increase contrast in the mask. You can move the highlight slider to the left and the midtone slider to the right to increase mask contrast. To decrease contrast, leave the light slider all the way over and move the midtone slider to the left. Luminosity masks often bleed throughout the image more than you think, since even dark gray pixels will still receive some degree of an adjustment. If you move the shadow slider to the right, you can add more black into those dark areas of the mask and completely conceal some of the pixels where unintended adjustments might otherwise occur. The new black and white buttons in the Modify section allow you to paint directly on the mask with a black or white brush respectively. You can paint with the black brush to conceal an adjustment from parts of the image entirely. And you can paint with a white brush to reveal adjustments in parts of the image entirely. The new burn and dodge buttons allow you to burn dark tones and dodge light tones directly on the mask to create more contrast in localized areas. Burning makes the dark tones in the mask even darker, but it does it just where you paint and it doesn't affect the lighter tones. The darker the darks become, the more they will conceal adjustments. Dodging makes the light tones in the image even lighter, but it does it without altering the darker tones. The lighter the lights become, the more they'll reveal adjustments in those areas. This is different than painting black or white on the mask with the black and white brushes, because those universally lighten or darken all the tones at the same time. The burn and dodge tool exposure is automatically set to 50%, but you can adjust it if you want the effect to build up faster or slower. This new button is for a modification called Mask the Rapid Mask. There are times when we only want a luminosity mask to affect certain parts of the image, like clouds in the sky, texture in the water, or maybe someone's face. If you find the mask that'll help you adjust what you want, for example, let's say the water in the foreground here, other areas of the image that have similar tones will also be included and adjusted even though you don't want them to be. To target the mask to just the part of the image you want, use the lasso tool or one of the other selection tools to select that area. Then click the Mask the Rapid Mask button to turn any areas outside that selection black in the mask. Now when applied to an adjustment, you'll just be adjusting the part of the image that you wanted to adjust. A save selection can also be used for this. For example, let's say you had previously made and saved a sky selection. Hold down Control or Command and click on your saved channel in the Channels panel. And now click the Mask the Rapid Mask button and it will now mask it just to the selected sky. The edge of the selection is appropriately feathered by the panel, which combines with the self-feathering of the mask to help make the adjustment blend as smoothly as possible. The Mask the Rapid Mask button should not be confused with the Mask the Mask technique, which you can learn by watching this video. They accomplish similar goals, but there's a key difference. The Mask the Mask technique puts the black on a separate group mask and doesn't paint over the luminosity mask itself. So it can be painted and repainted as much as needed without changing the luminosity mask at all. The Mask the Rapid Mask button, on the other hand, makes a permanent change to the luminosity mask when the concealed areas are filled with black. This means that you can't try to remove the black from an area where you don't want it without losing the underlying mask detail. But when it works, the Mask the Rapid Mask button is a much quicker method for applying a luminosity mask adjustment to a selected part of the image. The Curves button allows you to modify the mask with a curves adjustment. This is similar to modifying the mask with the levels slider, but with curves controls instead. The Brightness Contrast button allows you to modify the mask with a brightness contrast adjustment. And again, this is similar to adjusting with levels or curves. Each can give a slightly different result, and some people prefer using one over the other. The Invert button inverts the mask and creates essentially a negative of the mask. If you invert a narrower mask, like let's say a Darks 3, it will create a Lights mask that's even lighter than a Lights 1. The darker or lighter the original mask is, let's say like a Lights 5, then when we invert this, it'll be a Darks mask, but it'll be a really broad Darks mask. If you invert a midtone mask, you get a mask that instead of targeting the midtones, will target the highlights and the shadows and protect the midtones. The goal of all these new features in the Modify section are to give you more options for fine-tuning masks. So another new tool in TK7 is the Adobe Camera Raw or ACR modification. This allows you to modify a mask using the familiar adjustment sliders from Lightroom and Camera Raw. All of the sliders in the exposure section, as well as clarity and dehaze, can be used to modify the mask. You can also use the tone curve to modify the mask. But I think using the Camera Raw graduated, radial, and adjustment brush tools open up mask modification possibilities that are different to anything that you can do in Photoshop. For example, using the gradient tool, you can adjust the landscape part of the mask completely separate from the sky part of the mask. Using the radial tool, you can adjust the mask so that it's lighter in the middle so that more of the adjustment will be revealed in the middle, or you can adjust it so that it is lighter on the outside, so more of the adjustment will have effect on the outsides. And using the brush tool, you can paint in areas where you want to affect the mask, and then adjust how the mask is affected in those areas and leave it unadjusted in other areas. And you can even add a new brush and paint completely different adjustments into other parts of the image. I haven't used the Camera Raw Modify feature a lot at this point, but it's obvious to me that there's a lot of potential there. The expand and contract buttons do just what they say. Expand expands the light areas in the mask, and contract contracts the light areas in the mask. Repeated contracting and expanding can sometimes add useful contrast to a mask, but it's also easy to overdo it and lose all the feathering qualities of your mask. The blur button allows you to add blur to the mask. Occasionally, blurring the mask can be helpful for even better blending of the layer where the mask is applied, especially if the mask becomes too high in contrast like this one. However, when you blur a mask, it can also counteract some of the perfect feathering that comes from using these types of masks, so your results may vary. Finally, the mask calculator buttons allow you to add, subtract, and intersect multiple masks to create entirely new masks. Here's an example of mask subtraction. Let's say I wanted to use a Lights 1 mask, but I also wanted to protect the very brightest highlights from my adjustment. I'd start with the Lights 1 mask, then I would click the minus button to subtract, and then I might click a Lights 3 mask to see if those are the highlights that I want to protect. I think they are, but I'm also going to do an auto levels to brighten them up a little bit. And now I'll hit equals, and that will subtract those highlights from my Lights 1 mask. So this is the Lights 1 mask, but you can see those brightest Lights 3 highlights have been subtracted, and they're darker in those clouds, so I won't accidentally overexpose those clouds with my adjustment. Here's an example of adding masks together. Let's say that I want to make an adjustment to the midtones using a Midtones 2 mask, but I decide that I also want this particular adjustment to go into the clouds that are the brightest, which are not included in the midtones. So I would click plus to add, and then I might try a Lights 2 mask to include those brightest clouds, and then click equal. And now we can see that those clouds have been added into my Midtone 2 mask. Intersecting masks is the multiply button, and when you intersect masks, it combines the mask values that overlap between the two masks. Interestingly, intersecting a Lights 1 mask with another Lights 1 mask gives you a Lights 2 mask. So that mask is the same as Lights 2. The calculator was designed to handle all masks that could be created using the Rapid Mask module, including masks that have been modified. So if you want to use a Lights 1 mask, but you want to subtract those brightest highlights from the sky, but you don't want to subtract any highlights from the water, you'd click the minus, and then we might use, let's say, the Lights 2 mask to subtract those highlights, but now I could use the black brush to paint out all the highlights out of the water so I don't subtract any of those highlights. And now when I click equal, the sky has been subtracted, but the water has not. You can also combine luminosity masks with color masks. For example, you could start with a Lights 1 luminosity mask, but then you could click minus to subtract and subtract the warm color zone and click equal. And then I might add the cool color zone and auto levels it, but then paint out the water so that it's only happening in the sky. And now click equal. If you're doing a calculation and you click the wrong button, just click a different one and the calculator will switch for you. Or if you change your mind and decide you don't want to do a calculation after all, just click the same button again to turn the calculator off. The accent color lets you know which is the last thing that you did. So that's a whole bunch of ways that you can modify a mask with the Modify section. And when you're experimenting with the modification process, it can get out of hand, leading to an overcooked mask. When that happens, simply click the button of the mask that you started with to get back to your original mask, and you can start the process over.